thank you so much for being willing to sit down and have a conversation with us. Not that sitting down part, I'm sure you would have done that anyways.
I do a lot of sitting.
Don't we all these days?
Yeah.
A lot. But I guess maybe, well, we can get into things. We should figure out, first of all, why we're having this conversation. I can kind of explain why I wanted to have this conversation, but I have no idea why you want to have this conversation. So maybe I'll start with what I know.
I do this all the time. I'm a pastor. I talk to
exactly,
people.
And I don't get it. I don't know why. So
well, I think that's something from our side is like just understanding what a pastor is. Like that's something I was talking to Garrett about earlier today. It was like kind of coming from a history of being in, I guess, the North American evangelical church. And like for me, your content has really, it came after a common story that you always engage with on your channel where there's someone defecting from the church. I very much had a very similar kind of story arc in my life where coming up after high school, there was a bit of a defecting from the church and wondering what's valuable about it. And I was saying to Garrett, I kind of had this epiphany that I'm somewhat supporting like a pyramid scheme of like pastors creating pastors. And like I didn't want to be a pastor. And I remember there was a Sunday morning service where they like invited up all the kids that were like called to ministry. And I was going to like normal university. And I was like, that was sort of a nail in the coffin for me for a while. I was like, okay, so screw whatever I want to do. It's all about creating pastors. And for some reason, they duped us into funding this pyramid scheme, right? And then, Jordan Peterson started to kind of revive Christianity for me. And I think that's a common story. Yeah. And then from sort of a non-religious, non-church perspective. And then your content was a bit more of like, oh, okay, this is not what a pastor is. Like he's actually sort of creating something valuable, which, I kind of had seen it as a rent-seeking thing almost in my mind.
Well, and Jordan Peterson is like the new, I don't know, he's definitely the Jesus smuggler, because I was really trying to figure out whether or not I wanted to call myself a Christian or trying to figure out what the hell I am. And it was partially due kind of reconnecting with Connor that like made me think, okay, maybe not all Christians are idiots.
Just some of them.
Yeah. Well, and I think I've grown in a lot of compassion for the Christian idiot over the past several years too. Even just like, but that obviously that name is just a joke because the people I'm describing are not idiots. But I mean, so yeah, I guess I'm interested in you and your content partially just because Connor is like, hey, you should listen to Paul Vanderklay. He's a pastor, and I was like, that's interesting. I don't actually like pastors much anymore. There's not really any pastors I like to listen to, but that's part of the conversation itself. Is like, is that what a pastor does? Is just somebody you listen to?
Well, who that you listen to, and hopefully who listens to you too.
Right. Well, so right now you're actually listening to me too. So
yeah. Pastors do. You'll see pastors on Sunday morning talking with a lot of people listening to them, but throughout the course of a week, pastors do a lot more listening than talking generally.
Yeah. Well, like both of us, I don't know, especially being COVID right now, it's a weird thing trying to figure out I was just at the point where I was starting to ask myself the question, where I should probably go to church. Where do I go to church? How do I approach church? And then that question got kind of delayed a little bit. And then we got to this problem of I guess who am I going to listen to? And it's like, well, I already know plenty of people I want to listen to. There's some great speakers out there, but
yeah,
they don't live next door.
No.
So COVID
and that's a problem.
Shut that down. Yeah. The speaking or listening part of pastoring where, that's, like I'm going to a church, it's gone to online, and I'll be honest, I try to listen. My parents get up on Sunday morning and listen. I'll listen maybe sometime during the week if I get around to it. But it's hard to stay connected.
And the problem is like it's from a purely like just how good it is or like how interesting it is. It's difficult to find. Like I don't know. It's hard to find a good speaker. Speaking is hard, and people who are good at it, it's like that's something pretty cool when you could find somebody who's actually good at talking.
Yeah.
Well, now with the internet, I guess it's the best can kind of get a monopoly, and we have the technology to distribute only the best speakers. And so it's like, especially if there's no listening side of pastoring, is there much, what's the future of it in the COVID time, especially?
So maybe we can ask you just to kind of get the ball rolling a little bit. Why do you want to listen to people so much?
That's a good question. People are hard to listen to sometimes, which the internet will prove to you and demonstrate to you reliably. Listening is part of caring. And why should I care about randos and strangers?
Yeah.
And that's, a big part of what Christianity as a discipline and as a project is designed to deploy is, in fact, loving your neighbor all the way up to and including your enemy. That is not a natural thing. It is to a degree. We usually tend to love the people who love us back and do things for us or might do something for us. And so then we'll extend generosity. And humans aren't that. I mean, humans are mercenary, but there's obviously variability to it. But oh gosh, it's a tremendously difficult thing because it gets into the question of human motivation. And it would be nice to say, my motivations are pure and I listen to people because I love Jesus and he says to love everyone, but that's hardly true. That's, maybe the motivation I put up in front, but we're such bundles of mixed bags of emotion. But I have found that listening to people helps people. And, so I have a lot of homeless people that just as an accident of geography like to live against my office door. And so then I watch how the general population deals with those people. Now, these homeless people are usually some combination of mentally ill or substance abuse, or just have the kind of just lack a capacity to get along with anybody else. Okay. So in terms of people easy to love, they're in single digits. They're way down at the bottom. Yet total strangers will drive by, see someone in need like that, stop and give them cash, shoes, clothing, food. But to actually sit and listen to that homeless person for an hour, I'd probably rather give them cash because that when I lived in the Dominican Republic, people there had more time than money. North Americans tend to have more money than time. And so that's how we use our money to balance that. So it is an act of love to listen to someone and to care about what they're saying. And every child knows this because they want their parents to listen to them. Every spouse knows this because they want their spouse or their lover to listen to them. So it is an act of love to listen. And one of the things that I figured out as a pastor was, you go to school and you have all this education and you think you'll be helping people. But over the years, I discovered I helped people a lot more just by listening to them than by any advice I had to give. And you find the same thing with therapists often. They sit and they listen to people's troubles all day long, and people say, "Thank you, you've helped me a lot," right, and leave a check for 3 figures. So it's how the world is made better.
But what is this like? I don't. Maybe I do want to do that. I mean, I'm kind of figuring out what I want to do with I guess it's in style to start a podcast right now. So everybody wants to start a podcast.
Because we need more of them, that's for sure.
What did you say the other day that podcasts are probably over in 6 months?
Well, in some ways, we probably do need more connection. So, I mean, podcast is a broad umbrella. Not many podcasts. I think a lot of them are, people pivoting from a traditional media interviewer, journalist into this is just they just slap the podcast label and now it's trendy versus actually having conversations, which is
Right, that's
a
a different
subset of
medium.
podcasts, which is what you've expressed more interest in than interviewing, right?
Right. Which, yeah, so like, what is it about? Because I feel like as maybe kind of when you put your therapist or maybe we'll call it a pastoral role hat on, it's like maybe that's even more listening than it is talking. But what's the conversation like? What you're not just listening to people, you're letting random people take up time out of your day and tell you stuff, and like, is it interesting to you? Like,
most of the time. Sometimes it's a little dull. So part of, one of the most gratifying things that happened as a result of, I didn't expect to make a channel like this. I didn't sit down with a master plan. My channel just kind of grew. And it shouldn't have been surprising, but one of the more surprising things about my channel that grew were the conversations that, not only did people want to talk to me, they wanted to talk to each other. And so we have the Randos United channel, and Cassidy has a channel, and Andrea has a channel, and Karen has a channel, and Mary has a channel. And so people started having conversations and putting them on the internet. And then we had the Discord server, and people are always having conversations there. So I think the desire to make podcasts is the desire to be heard. And then, so you go ahead and you pay your $100 to Podbean and you get your podcast, and then you start putting stuff out into the world, and you look at the analytics and, all right, 3 people listen. That's your mom and my mom and some rando out there.
We could have just done this in the living room and not had to pay the $100.
Exactly. But to kind of swing back to the whole church conversation, people, and this, your questions about, I sit here with questions about what the future of the church is all the time. People go to church not because the pastor is the best speaker. People go to church to be loved and to find people who will look across the pews or the aisle or the casserole dish and say, you matter to me. Maybe not as much as my kid or even my dog, but you at least matter somewhat. And we need that.
Yeah, but making friends is hard too, though.
Yeah, it is. and churches kind of have a referee, not always a good one, but I was looking at the Bridges of Meaning Discord server, and little scraps break out there between people, and people get sideways of each other. The thing about a church is you're sort of, especially in the days, 50 or 100 years ago, you get sideways with someone, you're kind of under an obligation to, at some point, forgive and make up and move on.
Yeah.
And that's a really important skill, because most of the homeless people that I deal with, that's exactly the skill they don't have, and some of them can't have. And that's why they're living on the street.
Yeah.
It's not just money or drugs or mental illness.
Yeah.
Because they can't get along with anyone.
Well, that's what we were talking earlier, that like, I kind of see a pattern that there's problems in the church, but none of them are unique to the church. They're all general societal issues that, I see you kind of have your finger on the pulse of sort of what's going on in the zeitgeist, and you can bring a lot of that to the church. My worry is a lot of churches probably aren't doing that and seeing this. And, I was calling this aspect of it, the Great Divorce, as sort of a nod to C.S. Lewis, that there's, we have not only literal like marital divorce rates increasing, but there is, people just leaving the church, or church shopping seems so popular, and just the idea that you can, you don't have to have a commitment to a certain anything, or even country. Like, I think part of the political issues we see is the divorce of people politically, and it's, we haven't yet seen that undermine our, current Western political sphere, but I think there's certainly a thread of that. And so there's this kind of lack of commitment, or in some ways almost a lack of tradition. Like part of me wants to like kick my parents for not giving me a church that people just stayed at, like, or their parents. I don't know where it happened, but like why wasn't I given a culture of commitment? Now I have to basically choose what to commit to.
And part of it, I think, is just that like you go far enough back in history and commitment isn't really a choice. It's like now we have the budget to church shop and to life partner shop and to, well, even to counselor shop. And this is something I've noticed too, like looking like, how do you choose who's the right teacher for you other than just who's the most interesting to you? Because being interesting isn't the be all and end all variable that describes how good that person is going to be for you and how much of an impact they're going to have on your life. Just like, I want to listen to Jordan Peterson because I like it. But like, what if I need to be listening to that, you know, the pastor of that church that I really didn't care to be going to?
Yeah. And it's interesting that at least at this point, we haven't completely consumerized the medical profession, because if we chose our doctors like we're choosing these other things, I'm going to go to a doctor that says, you know, eat more, exercise less, and gain another 100 pounds.
I feel like it's creeping in there though too, and to some extent, it's even almost necessary depending on the problem that you're confronted with. Like even looking at what Peterson and his family have been struggling with, right? Like, what do you do with when what's kind of pre-prescribed doesn't work, but like no commitment doesn't work either?
Yeah, it's in a lot of ways we're the victims of our own success, whereas 100 or 200 years ago, you know, you stick with the marriage and you stick with the family and you stick with the church, because if you don't, well, you don't want to know what your life will look like. That's high risk, maybe some reward, but people who are ostracized, you know, 50 or 75 years ago in the Christian Reformed Church, if the preacher came and threatened you with church discipline, you got your act together, because you would be ostracized from that community. And that might mean, you know, confronting your alcohol habit, or, you know, ending the affair that's threatening your marriage, or, you know, a lot of difficult things. But we are victims in some ways of our own success.
Yeah. And like, well, and like trying to even I only got married 2 years ago, not even quite 2 years ago. I'm a very, very freshly married boy. But try to think, like, have these conversations with my wife. How, you know, under what circumstances do you consider divorce?
Yeah.
Like, what, and it's like, I don't know how to have that conversation, because if you know,
ride or die.
I mean, yeah, like if you're willing to consider a scenario where it's like that wasn't built into the vows. The vows said in sickness and in death. But so is it not really marriage if there's a contingency plan?
Yeah.
I don't know how to work out commitment when you don't really have to commit.
Yeah.
So if you're like a young person today and you want commitment, but like can society remove that for you? Like where can you find that if you're looking for it?
Well, the first thing you should do is practice commitment. Everybody wants to be,
right.
You know, I want you to commit to me, but I want my options open.
Yeah.
Oh,
and power game.
Yeah.
So, you know, Peterson, it's interesting because Peterson is, you know, someone just commented on the Discord. He makes the most compelling case for monogamy in marriage much better than he's ever heard any minister. And he's not using the Bible or God or anything like that. He's just making an argument. And we want commitment from others, but we recognize how costly it is. And I think that at some point, if you're actually going to be the kind of person that others will love and want in their life, you're going to have to learn how to lay down your life for the other. And I remember when, you know, marriage was sort of one step of learning to deal with confronting my own selfishness. I didn't realize how selfish I was until I was married, and my wife starts putting some demands on me. And if you really want a lesson in that, have a kid, because there's no reasoning with a newborn. Can't you see it's 3 a.m? No, they can't. You're going to let the kid cry all night? No, you won't. People do. Babies do die at the hands of their parents, but fortunately, there's a lot in you that says you love this child and you're about to make incredible sacrifices for this child, and that child is actually going to teach you what love means, and the lessons don't end as the child grows up.
Yeah.
So, and it's that way that a lot of this stuff is built into us, but we can reject it. We regularly do.
Well, and it seems like it's the most powerful instinct. It makes sense to be sort of the familial one. And I assume that's sort of what you mean when you say built into us, that it's like it's an instinct measure.
Yeah.
But it's like even that level, like we said with the divorce rates going up, it's like that's, I don't know. It's just a scary story, I guess, when I'm looking at the world and trying to figure out where are we going and I think what you said, that's probably right. Probably the way you protest it is to just commit to something.
Yeah.
And I guess I've been sort of experimenting with that a little bit, calling myself an evangelical, despite the fact that I feel like probably most evangelicals won't want me. Like, sorry, this is my family. I was born into this tradition, and I'm still really not understanding the question if I need to like I even heard like the Pageau brothers, like they became Orthodox. They were,
yeah.
And it's like, is that an option? Should I do that? I don't. Do you become another religion, or just are you one and you discover it?
Yeah.
Well, I think there's something in you that's like because there was a time in my life when I was sort of attending church still, but I had in my mind affected, and there's a cultural word or a cultural kind of stigma against that they call like hypocrisy. So you could say that I was a hypocrite because I was going, even though I didn't always believe. But is hypocrisy, I guess, the opposite of commitment? Because in one way, I was enacting that kind of choosing to, even though just with my actions, I was acting it out, but in my mind and my heart, I wasn't really bought in. But in the long run, I'm so glad that I didn't totally step out, because I was able to then revive a lot of that for myself, down the road. So the commitment paid off, but it's like, it's so weird because I kind of had this guilt of like, am I a hypocrite?
Is that sort of even what faith is too? It's just like doing something because you got to do it, not because it makes sense. It's just like, I spent a lot of my teens trying to like make sense of faith, or like trying to thinking about like faith isn't really faith unless it's reasonable. And it's like I think the opposite now. I don't think faith is really faith until it's not reasonable, because it's like faith is what you do when your other faculties are telling you something, or your more immediate faculties are telling you to do something different. It's like having faith in somebody, or being faithful in a relationship, or being faithful to your community. It's like, even in that situation where you're like, I don't know if I believe this. It's like, well, who cares? Just do it.
So, like, ironically enough, when I would say I had the least faith, I might have had the most faith.
Yeah. Huh. Well, the age of authenticity has sort of monkeyed with this, because we sort of have become creatures that watch ourselves incessantly. And okay, but that's complicating your life. I mean, when you wake up in the morning and you brush your teeth, oh, am I brushing my teeth because of the tyrannical dental establishment? Ought I to be free to let my teeth rot?
Yeah, in order to act, you have to like kind of be willing to be dishonest, or willing to be misrepresented. Or it's like doing or saying anything is sort of potentially saying or meaning more than you intend it to. But sorry, that's just the way communication works, or the way action works.
Yeah.
But I guess true. Maybe we can transition here into something, because I wanted to ask you, I don't know if it's a personal question. Maybe if you don't feel like pushing the conversation this direction, that's fine. But how have you? I imagine like within your own immediate circles, becoming a just to be trolly, I'll say a disciple of Jordan Peterson has maybe affected some of your relationships or some of your peers or some of like you're part of the CRC, which is not. I mean, when you talk about the theology that like is part of that isn't something I'm familiar with. Like my dad was part of the Dutch Reformed Church, but like, so I'm familiar with Calvinism a little bit, and maybe I could ask you some questions about Calvinism later. But like, how are you staying committed to your people in light of a developing worldview?
I never found my interest in Jordan Peterson as threatening to my Christian commitment at all. I think probably I imagine I have the largest YouTube following of any Christian Reformed minister. I think it's probably pretty easily the case. And I think a fair number of colleagues of mine and friends were concerned. First, they didn't know anything about Jordan Peterson, and then via the reputational hit job that was done on him, now suddenly I'm somehow aligned with the wrong side of the aisle. Okay. I'm not particularly worried about that.
Maybe past the identity thing though, just like even Jonathan Pageau's interpretation though of like Old Testament biblical stories, that's not something that especially when I talk to my parents, that's not something that they're really comfortable with at all. When I start talking about like Moses maybe not being a historical person in the literal way they were thinking, or like Jonah being a story that's historical, or the creation account not being as literal, or at least in the way they might mean literal.
Yeah, I'm not. A lot of people listen to Pageau, and because he leans on the symbolic, they make assumptions about questions about historicity, which he usually sort of just completely sidesteps and says that's not entirely relevant. And that gets into some of the videos I'm making now, doing some reading in George Marsden about fundamentalism. There's I for one don't feel the need to be a skeptic about historicity of things in the Bible. I don't feel the need to be skeptical about that. And I look at a lot of people who do feel the need to be skeptical about that and think you're only skeptical about that because of peer pressure and status pressure. Did you go and I don't see you hopping planes to Jordan and Egypt and the Sinai looking for evidence of the Mosaic journey across the desert. Why are you so worried about your reputation with respect to who was Jonah and what was his boat trip like?
Right.
It's that entire debate arose in a particular context in the church that I understand why people were anxious about it, but these kind of questions about details in the Bible were with us far before the modernist fundamentalist fight. So, you can, and in fact, even people such as John Calvin, when asked questions about, perspectives and ancient Hebrew cosmology, wrote, the Bible is written to a common man looking at the world through common eyes. That was John Calvin's answer to that. Augustine had all sorts of ideas about creation and Genesis and that account. So these questions have always been with us, but a certain battle arose in the 19th, earlier, really 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century around these issues that sort of became defining markers. And I'm interested in some of those ideas, but I don't think people on either side are generally terribly well equipped to fight those battles. And so I don't worry about them.
the thing that I'm more annoyed by in that conversation is just well, I mean, I don't know where your community's at, but like when it comes to like the churches I grew up, and I say churches because I used to be part of my grandparents' touring like evangelical ministry. So I went to a lot of different, especially Assemblies of God, charismatic churches, Pentecostal churches, all over the place. And I got the impression that like evolution was a swear word,
Right.
and it was like, especially, I don't like reading some of Dawkins and reading and listening to Brett and Heather talk about evolution. It's like that. Even though the biology part of it, I sometimes can get lost in all the data and all that you can know about particular animals. I love hearing them talk about the systems of evolution, because it's like that. Those principles seem to be useful for analyzing like everything. And when kind of my community says, hey, you know, evolution is just anti-Christianity propaganda, it's really frustrating to me.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm getting a lot of flack from, I mean, maybe not a lot of flack, but I at least annoy my parents whenever I try to reference anything to do with evolution or the earth being old. And it's like, I don't know. I guess that was where my question was heading, but maybe you haven't experienced much of that.
No, those fights have been in the Christian Reformed Church for a long time. I think probably better than trying to master either the evolution or the biblical interpretation might be to read some church history around these subjects by guys like George Marsden, who's, you know, has written more about fundamentalism and some of these fights than a lot of people. And you begin to see that the church fights are a lot more complex than, well, you might ask yourself, why do we have these pitched battles around certain concepts? What about those concepts were salient? For example, the Scopes trial, the famous trial in Dayton, Tennessee. Right. Who was William Jennings Bryan, and why was he fighting that battle? A lot of why he was fighting that battle was because they were seeing pretty clearly in the early 20th century a eugenics that was pretty commonly assumed by the intelligentsia that was blatantly racist. Now, today, people don't look at that history because basically Hitler scared that out of our culture for maybe 75 years to say, oh, well, you know, the history of Planned Parenthood. I mean, if you actually dig into history on these things, everybody's got mud on their face. And so I get asked, and there's lots of other tricks you can play with people. Like, people want to get really gnarly about this. I'll ask them about the science that put gas in their car tank, or the science that their doctor learned in order to treat them. They don't reject the doctor or the geologist. Why are you jumping up and down in your church? So probably they're too excited about some things that they shouldn't be. Yet still deep within the DNA was a very strong point that is salient to that fight, which was that people and traditions that sort of caved early on these things did in fact lose their way. And so maybe a certain biblicism, while certainly has some technical problems to it, actually managed to preserve a living, breathing congregation
and tradition. It's almost that faith thing.
Yeah. So it's really complex as you dig into it. And so I tend to not try to poke people in their axioms too much on either side, because most people, like I say, they're not traveling to Sinai to try and search for the historical Moses.
Yeah.
How much does it really matter to them? Yet if they sort of cave in and say, oh, it's just all a myth, well, now suddenly other knotty questions arise. Well, what about that resurrection of Jesus?
Right.
Because if that is just sort of a story, how much can I necessarily count on sacrificing, back to where we started talking about, sacrificing my time and my life for someone else who might not ever actually give anything back to me to compensate for that sacrifice. So these are issues, but when I look at how they're fought over, I've never seen that as tremendously productive.
Yeah, I think I could even testify to you pointing at, if you're frustrated with that, looking at church history to sort of get some release. Because I think that's part of what really appealed to me about your context is I was like 20 years old. I grew up in a tradition, but I didn't understand the history of it at all. I had no church history, or I didn't understand even other, like, it seems like there's so many denominations that almost doesn't even make sense when I'm actually reading the Bible. Like, when did this happen and why did this happen? And you were really a foot in the door for me to just kind of put my experience in the context of, well, there's a whole range of experiences that are all still sort of Christianity. And, I guess I go to one church, but it's maybe in this community, I don't have to reflect the views of everyone. Actually, probably the value of the community is heightened by more of us having some of these different perspectives, as long as we, I guess, have a tolerance for the different perspectives, which maybe is, I guess that gets into like, do you get to choose how tolerant the community you're embedded in is going to be?
Right. Well, and another thing, I like, when community is too much about agreeing about things and having the same opinion and having the same stances on things, then you lose some of the freedom to kind of go on a personal journey and explore some stuff. Because if I know that my community is still going to be there for me and they're still going to be believing the same things, even while I go on an expedition and wondering whether or not Jesus actually, sort of historically rose from the dead, or whether or not Genesis is true or is literal. Like, there's actually somebody I kind of have some gripes with, but has said some really meaningful things that helped me in my journey, is Michael Gungor. And he was talking about when he was kind of, he became an atheist and the world fell out from underneath him and everything changed. He had a pivotal moment in that journey where he realized that if God actually exists, I don't have to make him exist by believing in him. Right? There's a freedom of, like, if the truth is really true, and that's what it is by definition, I don't need to believe it. It can just be. And I can go and be wrong. And having that freedom to go and be wrong and have something to return to and know that it's still, I guess that's, it only loosely ties into having a congregation that's still going to be believing the same thing when you come back from your pilgrimage. But
yeah,
it's nice to have some stability to come back to.
I think part of what we're probably going to face is that a lot of churches aren't going to be there because the people who have been paying for, the building and the staff, a lot of them are getting old and dying. And so I see that often where people think, the church will always be here. Yeah. It's a lot of places it's disappearing. And
yeah, that's scary.
And what's gonna, it always strikes me that when people knock on my door looking for help of some kind, they didn't go to the AM PM, they didn't go to the convenience store, they didn't go to the supermarket, they didn't go to the drugstore. They came to a church. Why did they come to a church? What happens if that church is no longer here? And churches do a lot of lifting in a community that mostly goes unheralded. Mm-hmm. And when those churches are gone, what are you going to raise taxes?
Yeah. Well, and I've been kind of thinking about that too, even though in the moment I feel like I forgot that that's where we're headed. And yeah, that's a really terrifying thing to think about, especially with, I wonder if maybe the new appreciation a lot of people have garnered for religion and for church due to this kind of new wave of like just interest in the Bible through people like Peterson and Pageau, maybe that'll help. But I kind of have been internalizing a little bit of a lot of the problems. Like I feel like some people's response to going through sort of deconstruction journey is to kind of be able to just take everything they dislike about themselves and every problem they had with the world and just throw it on their tradition and say, well, that was all the problems, and now I can get rid of that. And I see how that's a really easy trap to fall into, and I'm sure I fall into it in a lot of other ways, but I've been trying not to do that when it comes to, my like evangelical tradition. I've been trying to identify with it anyways, and then from there kind of look and say, well, what are we doing wrong that's causing this fracturing or this fault? Like, did we not rise to meet this situation very well? Because it seems like we're headed for trouble. Like, what did we miss? Is it just too hard of a level to beat? Like, is this just the level where is this just an apocalypse where mostly everybody dies?
I remain optimistic about the church. The difficulty with transitions like this is that there's a lot of loss. But at the same time, churches are constantly morphing to be able to once again grow out of their community and engage their community. It's just that the transitions are very costly. So, in terms of church life, it's often I've been very bullish on church planting because it's easier to have a baby than to raise the dead. And a church like mine is probably going to die. And with it, a lot of good things are going to die. But there will be other churches that rise up and learn some things. Mm-hmm. But there's just a lot of loss in the transition. So what we started talking about earlier in this conversation, what does it mean if you go back 50 years ago, especially to rural areas, you didn't have a lot of options in terms of church. You go to the church that your family went to or your community went to. Now, suddenly via the internet, you can listen to the best preachers and speakers who align with you on various social dimensions and hone that. And the likelihood that you're going to find a local church with a pastor that can rival that,
right,
pretty low. So then what is the local church going to be? It will probably be that community that it might not necessarily align doctrinally with everything. And again, churches sort of did that as a result of the fracture of the Protestant Reformation. But there might be an entirely different configuration. Even now, if you look at, let's say, more sacramental traditions that have been light on homilies, the Orthodox or the Roman Catholic, nobody goes to those churches for the homily. They go for the Mass, right, and they go for the liturgy, and they go for the Eucharist. Okay. And then people are maybe getting that at their local church, but they're learning on YouTube or on podcasts. Right. So there's going to be a lot of continued dislocation. My concerns arise that the churches have been physically rooted in places, and that physicality has been fundamental to a lot of the dynamics of church life that are not easily reproduced in a cyber environment. Right. And we have no idea how we're going to manage that transition.
Yeah. Well, yeah, like even you would think sort of that all that goes into a conversation with somebody is like, audio and visual. Like it intuitively, or maybe, I don't know, it reasonably makes sense that right now we're having the same thing as if I was sitting in your office, but we're not. Like no. That it's not the same thing. There's actually an infinite more amount of data that we are having and experiencing and sort of interfacing with when we're face to face with people, and we don't have a good way of quantifying that, because it just seems like, well, I can see you and I can hear you, so isn't that the same thing? Isn't that the same thing?
Yeah.
But
that's why
how do I say that it's not?
Therapists weren't allowed to do this.
Yeah.
Now during COVID, a lot of therapists, it's the only way they can do it.
Right.
And they understood the difference. But yet here we are.
I think the liturgy side is really a big part of what's missing. I work online, so it's all like 100% meetings. And I was talking to my wife that like I'm nervous that I'm gonna forget the like kind of polite patterns once we go back in the office to like even introduce. Like there's sort of a just lack of like hello greeting it's just sort of fallen away as we've switched to basically a two-dimensional video, audio, sometimes just audio dialogue. As
Eric Weinstein would argue and say that it is 3 dimensions.
Yeah, the waves are in space-time. Yeah, well, and even the liturgy side is really what I think I still have some sort of longing for in my church. Like I'm at a church that's pretty abnormal, very focused on sort of community outreach, which is the dimension you were talking about. But when I listen to Pageau and hear about Orthodox, I kind of have this longing for just kind of doing like performing something, I don't know, like going through the emotions that we really don't do.
Right. It's funny, the negative connotation of hearing you say a phrase like going through the motions. It's like there's been such a deep rejection of that idea that like that's a derogatory statement, going through the motions. But like that's exactly what I want to do.
Yeah. And like Pentecostal, they'll be like, we're not just going through the motions, we're gonna have a real like, encounter.
No, let's just go through the motions.
Yeah, maybe we could start with going through the motions and the encounter will come later.
Well, and even like, so for a short period I was going to a church called the Meeting House. Maybe you're familiar or you've heard the name Bruxy Cavey before. Maybe not. Anyways, that his book is called The End of Religion, and it's about how God wants a real relationship with you. And like one of the, I mean, I read his book, and there one of the I thought were the most meaningful and interesting parts of it was like he talks about, you know, in a marriage, you don't like, that's not a good marriage if it's just built on doing the same. Like if you figure out a couple of loving things to do, like let's say take your wife out on a date to a fancy restaurant and give her a rose and tell her she looks beautiful, and you know, if you have a checklist of really nice things you could do for her and you just do that every day, that's not what makes a good marriage. So there is an argument to be made that pattern without, you know, engagement can be dead. And I Orson Scott Card says that in a really cool way in Speaker for the Dead. He talks about how religion is like the bones of the body or of society, and it's like by themselves they're literally dead, but it's these energetic, these things don't have any form on their own, but like the muscles and the sinews that pull the bones into life. Mm-hmm. And it's like you need the bones there, but you also need the muscle to pull things around. And it's like, so I understand the frustration of religion without anything else, and I understood his book, like, you know, The End of Religion. Sure, yeah, we need to not just have religion, but I always see almost everything. Every teaching and every popular book I see rise up in not just Christian circles, just whenever somebody wants to make a point, they always say, not this, and almost every time when you make a statement in that format, you're wrong, because it's not this, it's this, but also this.
Yes,
yeah.
The power goes out one night in your house, and honey, why did the power go out? You know, I just wasn't really feeling paying that electric bill. I paid every month. It's kind of rote, but it just doesn't feel authentic to me anymore. Honey, I don't give a rat's ass about authenticity. Pay the bill. No, and it's so true. And you know, that gets into, again, this whole question of authenticity. So it's fascinating watching, you know, sort of the churn of church in North America. And it's so funny because I talked to Anglican clergy in Australia and the UK, and I tell them, I say, you know, your church is total hotness right now. And they're like, we ain't feeling it. I don't see that at all. I'm saying, no, all the hip young folks in California are, you know, grooving on the liturgy and the holy water and calling it Eucharist, and they're loving that stuff. And Australia, they're like, nah, everything's Hillsong. You know, they don't want to come by this old Anglican church. it's amazing.
So it's at least evident that it's very difficult to hold those two things in tandem.
Yeah. And anyone who's married will understand that. Does your wife want some of those rituals? Yeah. Does she want you to mean it? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an easy place to bring it home, because it really goes home right there.
So why do you two want to do a podcast?
Ooh. Well, I was hoping maybe your clarification of why you were doing yours would help me explain why I want to do mine. But I probably
it's because we're good Christians.
We're good Christians.
We want to talk to people.
Yeah, that's why. We're just so loving. I don't know. I think it's probably similar to, like, when I heard, I'll just steal Jonathan Pageau's answer then, because he said, like, you know, why are you going and talking to all these atheists? I don't know. I just feel like I'm supposed to. And it seems interesting to me. And, like, as far as the whole phenomenology that Peterson talks about all the time, it's like, that's what's, you know, reality is what calls to you. It's like, this just feels like real. It feels like the thing I want to do. I need to go and have some conversations, and I want to be better at it too. I feel like, you know, realizing that speaking isn't just something that people do. It's actually a skill you have to hone and work on and practice and learn from other people how to do it better. And the conversation is a step higher than speaking, because you have to also learn how to listen well.
Yeah. And
I think, I don't know, maybe just those tools seem really interesting. I think I might be able to make something with those tools.
Good.
But, okay. Well, I don't know how much time you still have to hang around. What time is it now? So we've been talking for half an hour?
Talking for an hour.
For an hour.
Or
okay.
half an hour.
An hour, okay. Yeah.
Took a few minutes to set up.
Yeah. Well, what's kind of our cutoff point? I think
I have to be done an hour from now, but
okay.
That's my drop dead thing.
Okay. Well, so we can at least go another 5 minutes anyways.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I had a couple of things I wrote down that I thought maybe if we get a chance, I can ask these questions. But let's see. I think I wanted to ask you about Calvinism a little bit. Maybe you could school me a little bit. Because, so there's two questions I had about it. Because, I mean, I grew up with my dad and you know, him being Dutch, my opa really being hard advocates for Calvinism. And I all I understood of it was, you know, there's some people out there that want to take away my freedom. And I was like, no, I don't like that. I'm free. I could do whatever I want. And also relationship doesn't mean anything unless I can choose it. So obviously I have choice. That has to be it. And I guess, I don't know, hearing some of the things that you've underlined, listening to I listened to a lot of your videos this past week because I was like, crap, I've only seen like maybe 10 of his videos before, and now we're going to have a conversation. I need to go and really do the deep dive.
And you found it was hopeless. I can't listen to them all.
I was like trying to stay current, and since I decided to start trying to keep up with you, I think I've maybe watched 10% of the videos you put out since that moment. So yeah, that proved to be an impossible task. But as I've heard you talk a little bit and underline some different things in Calvinism, I thought, oh, that's interesting. One of which even being, you brought up the idea, I'm not sure if maybe it was even in your conversation with that kid, TK, I don't know.
Coleman?
TK Coleman, I think so.
Yeah.
If that's his last name. If
might be
somebody
wrong.
could correct us if that's wrong.
Yeah.
But I think you brought up the idea, maybe it was in that video, but that like there's a common thread in Calvinism and like critical race theory. In that they both have this idea that your sin is baked into you.
Yeah.
Like, and for the Calvinist, it's like, I assume it's more because of Adam or because of a fallen nature. But then for the critical race theorist, it's because of colonization or because of our culture being, you know, having a white supremacy built into it. So I wondered if maybe you could unpack that a little bit more, because that seemed pretty interesting to me.
Critical race theory, as you said, says we have some of this stuff baked into us, and it's not. and we're not sufficient to release ourselves from it. And that is deep into Calvinism. And not just, well, part of the difficulty about talking with Calvinism is that certain forms of Calvinism have become popularized recently, and the Calvinist world is quite a bit broader than those particular forms. John Calvin was basically a second generation reformer, and he tried to, usually with the first wave, like with Luther, and then the Anabaptist, the Radical Reformation, is just an explosion and stuff was left all over the floor. And in some ways, Calvin, who was a French refugee, trained as a lawyer, starts picking up the pieces and say, let's see if we can bring some order to this mess. And Calvin's reordering basically gave a broad Protestant template that most, with the exception of the Lutherans and the Anabaptists, which are Mennonite Brethren, some of those groups, a broad template that most Protestant churches have sort of followed. Now, 100 years after Calvin, they had some really big fights about issues surrounding choice and agency. And those arose, I think, to a large degree because of both the political and the philosophical issues of the day, and basically in a response to Arminianism, that is a Calvinist heresy. So it's a branch off of Calvinism that emphasized free will. And so when they went this way, the rest of the group went that way. And that sort of set up the dynamic that if Calvinism continues to get raised, that's what people are talking about. And I'd prefer them to see, before that split, the general work that Calvin had done. Part of what I saw happening with respect to critical race theory was a pattern that I had seen in particularly conservative doctrinal Calvinists that would say something like, yes, I'm totally depraved. And that profession of their depravity gave them status in the community, whether or not they did much about it. And having worked much of my life in African American communities, I watched the same thing happen. People getting all in touch with their privilege. And it's like, there's lots of folks here that could probably use your help, but you got in touch with your privilege, and that means you're going to vote for one particular party or hate the other particular party and talk about that with all of your people over here. I don't see that as doing anything for any of the people that might actually need your help. And I think, and then it was energizing a lot of people from minority communities to basically set up and say, all of our problems are because of those people. And, well, I'm sure many of your problems are, and due to the systems and whatnot, that's not going to help you. You're going to have to, if your life is hard, it probably means you're going to have to work harder. And anyone that's just saying you can sit back and relax and let all these people who now are completely imprisoned by their racism, that these are going to be your saviors. Has the second part of the paragraph read the first part of the paragraph? I mean, I'd watch this stuff happen and think, this is just incoherent. So, and I saw those same kind of dynamics happen within Calvinist communities. We're totally depraved, so we have to redouble our efforts. It's like, well, wait a minute. That totally depraved hand is the same hand you're counting on to fix your life. And so, when you get to the 5 points of Calvinism that are outlined in the Canons of Dort, when I read those, I see an ardent plea and appeal to Jesus Christ to be our rescuer. But if we imagine that in some way undercut our responsibility, then why have Calvinists both talked the 5 points and excoriated their community and tried to build institutions that do well in the world. If there's anything that the 5 points of Calvinist can't mean, it's that, oh, well, we're totally depraved. Let's just wait and see if God chose us or not.
See, I always thought that Calvinism, just leads. If there's no freedom, well, then nihilism is the only feasible perspective. Is like none of my choice means anything because I don't have it anyways.
Right. And that would be a rational position to take if these 5 points of Calvinism were exactly what that implies. But what I actually saw was that Calvinists were actually historically extraordinarily energetic people in terms of all sorts of things. Now, didn't always perform well, but if there's anything that I know, it's the 5 points of Calvinism don't make Calvinists lazy, because I haven't seen a lot of lazy Calvinists. So then I always take a look at the canons of Dort in the light of another one of our historical confessions that the Dutch Reformed have long had, which is the Heidelberg Catechism. And that's why I continually emphasize misery, deliverance, gratitude, because all of the energy that Calvinists have poured into improving the world is out of gratitude. And so if you understand how the canons of Dort and the Heidelberg Catechism actually work together, you can actually arrive at both embracing and saying, yeah, everything I do is tainted by sin. That's true of me. And there's nothing that I can do to earn status with God. That's also true of me. But what do I rely on? Then I rely on Christ's mercy, which cannot be threatened by anything in this world. Therefore, I can freely go out into the world and try to lay down my life and pour my life out for this world. And if I fail, you know what? It's not a surprise, because I still got the canons of Dort. But if I'm also free to fail in a sacrificial way, because my salvation is not dependent upon it. And so when I look at things like the Weber thesis that say, oh, it's Calvinist anxiety that sent them out into the world to try to gin up evidence of their salvation. Well, maybe, but that seems dumb to me. So I'm going to look at the Belgic Confession and the Heidelberg Catechism and work with them both. And so that's why in my preaching, I always emphasize misery, deliverance, gratitude.
It's funny, the other side of it, like, so even though, people who are just learning science or philosophy or things like this, they're not part of the Christian conversation about Calvinism versus Arminianism or whatever you want to counter it with. The conversation still comes up. Like I remember earlier last year, we were reading Sapiens, and Yuval Harari makes that statement that, like, we don't have free will, and the other day I was talking with my dad about, we were trying to figure out what sin is, and I don't know if we made any progress, but it's like, if sin is just not hitting the mark, then yeah, obviously everyone and everything is constantly in utter sin, because we are not being God, or like we're not being perfect. And so it's like, yeah, obviously all of us are incredibly sinful and don't have free will.
We're Calvinists again. But that doesn't mean people just sit around.
Right.
And that's what I saw, because I saw astoundingly moral and energetic people doing all kinds of things to help their neighbor and lay down their life. And, well, whatever the canons of Dort means, it certainly doesn't mean that these people are passive, because that's what I was hearing people complain about Calvinism. Oh, that would make me passive. And it's like, I know a lot of Calvinists. I don't see them as passive.
Right. So it's the tree and the fruit phenomenon.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, and they will know us by our fruit, right?
Right.
Yeah. And again, the Weber thesis was, well, Calvinists are energetic because they're anxious about producing fruit that, it's like, what are they dumb? Because that's an obvious trick. And to me, the logic of the Heidelberg Catechism just proved better.
Well,
and
they're both
I didn't
legitimate motivations, right? I'm motivated in one way to not do bad and another way to do good, right? And sometimes I need one and sometimes I need the other. I think that's also Peterson's self-authoring.
And that's that holding two things at once that seem to be in total conflict as well. Like I one of the things, so we started a book club a little while ago, and the first book that we read was The Great Divorce. And there's this crazy chapter that I think we all read a couple times trying to understand it. And like, I still think I need to read it a bunch more, but the conclusion I kind of got from it was just like, I don't know, he plays with the whole free will and predestination thing for a while, and he plays with the opposite. And then he kind of says at the end, or basically I would sum it up as he says, yeah, both of these are right. If you think one of them's wrong, you're just not understanding it right.
Well, it depends on where you are in time. Like the past is obviously determined and the future is very obviously not. So from the present, both do exist. And from outside of time, then both exist even in the same place, which obviously we are not outside of time, so we can't actually understand that.
So it just depends on where you're looking, whether the earth is flat or if it's a globe.
Exactly.
Oh, I like Tim Keller's answer to this, because he said, if everything was determined, then I wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. But if nothing was certain, then I'd be terrified to get out of bed in the morning. And so the Bible seems to be sort of a compatibilist about this. It likes to talk about, chosen from the foundations of the earth. And also the biblical writers are making, pleas to people to put on, to walk in Christ's love and move with the Spirit. Well, I don't think they imagined we had no agency, but I also don't imagine that we're just leaving it up to us. And so how to formulate this and get it right, well, that's pretty hard when you put pen to paper. So, but at the same time, I think we understand you can't look at our lives and say so much hasn't simply been determined by the times that we live and the genetics that we have and the formation that we've had no control over. All of those things are tremendously powerful in our life. Does that mean we have no agency? I don't think that's true either. So,
and I think probably maybe what you're getting at least where I'm getting from this, is like, how do we deal with that? It's not a matter of figuring it out or like figuring out which one is right. It's like, I actually need people in my life of both of those motivations, because there's perspective that come from that sort of philosophical or theological experiment that I'm not going to get if I'm engaged with one instead of the other. And I kind of need to pick one, because, or else I don't have as much, I don't have as much bought into either perspective to really get as deep as I might want to. So it's like, it comes back to the relationship thing. It's like, I need to have a community. I need to have a church, and it can't be built on agreeing with people. I actually really want other people to run different theological experiments in their lives that I can glean from and have available to me.
Yep. And the church provides that, actually.
Yeah.
As does church history.
Well, the classical church does, but I don't know what if the Patreon format of church is going to provide that.
Well, and I think partly that could be, a sign of the times and the like you got the discussion earlier about the church dying. Well, maybe 90% of the church dies, and then we return to that model that we were talking about, where there's only one church that you get to go to anyway. So it's
the scarcity creates a new a new
so it's like I'm not worried that all of them would die, and of course there's pain in some of them going away, but you look for it and then you're gonna find it, and you're gonna learn to share
share a space with so maybe that scarcity is going to be the exact valuable thing that we've been looking for.
90% of churches in America have less than 75 people in them, and I would say the numbers are greater if you look around the world. If there's one thing Christians are good at, it's starting small churches. And they're so we actually have a facility here. And there seems to be a near endless supply of churches that are between 20 and 50 people that they've outgrown the house and they want the next space up. And so most of them can't afford commercial real estate. So, churches will probably maybe buy mini malls and, try to at least have, it's a crazy thing once I was going someplace and drove into a strip mall, and here's a little storefront church, the kind of storefront churches you usually see. And here's another, like an Antiochian Orthodox church in the storefront right next door. And I thought, they're aspiring to have a cathedral someday, but you got to start somewhere. So, you just imagine a dozen people in that ugly little storefront going through the liturgy. that's with their vestments and the whole thing. That's probably where we're heading.
The other thing about scale, though, I've been wondering about, and I don't really understand what to do, because I don't know if you've listened to that guy Daniel Schmachtenberger at all.
Yeah,
he's brought up that problem of the Dunbar number, right? There's a critical point where you stop being able to care about everybody who's part of your group because there's just too many. And that's kind of the narrative I see whenever I look at a city or look at just any large enough group. It's like you stop being able to identify with it because it's not you anymore.
But I mean, you can choose to identify with it to the point that it benefits you against other groups of that size, right? and so you're going to buy in at a country level just because of the sheer benefit on a global scale.
Yeah.
Right. And I think it's just maybe the importance is having those stratas all the way down without significant gaps that, perhaps the church was one of those gaps was one of those strata that's now, disintegrating.
Yeah.
Like you used to be able to get insurance through your church, right? Because it makes sense as a level of, collective to share. You have enough, I guess, sway with the people that you're willing to buy into a shared, cost of certain things.
So what's happened with churches is that the middle has been squeezed out. So 90% of the churches are under 75, but I don't know what percentage, a good percentage of people go to churches over 1,000 people.
Mega churches, yeah.
Mega churches. And because mega churches can deliver a certain kind of thing, and little churches. So then what happens in mega churches is then they have all of this small group ministry and all of these other little boutique ministries within to try to approximate. But what the mega churches can offer, the little churches can't offer. But if
it's like they both
say you
specialize too much.
Yeah, well, the marketplace has been doing it because the Christian Reformed Church is mostly made out of middle-sized churches. They're churches less than 1,000, but more than 100. And so the Christian Reformed Church tends to not be doing well in urban areas, but is doing just fine in rural areas because they can continue to afford sort of the middle-sized church.
Oh,
the church is, people like Daniel Schmachtenberger has no idea of how fervently the church studies itself with respect to these things, especially since the church growth movement. There is nearly endless sociological studies and demographic studies going on about all of this stuff all the time, because you actually have a lot of pastors whose livelihood sort of is built on having a going concern. And so there's a lot of that going on too.
It just seems like a bad, no, the economic way of looking at it is like the Pareto distribution problem, right? It's like, how do you prevent, like, systems seem to just fall towards this disparity of like everybody's at one place, or, like everything's on the one, or it's the 80-20 principle, right?
Yep.
But it's like, how do you prevent systems from having the middle fall out? How do you hold them? Like, to me, I don't know, in a really symbolic and abstract way, it's like Christ is the middle, or he's what holds the whole thing together. And it's like, Jesus is disappearing.
Well, Jesus is in the little church and Jesus is in the mega church, and they both have their strengths and weaknesses. But, we might ask, well, why did the middle-sized church thrive in the middle of the 20th century? Because that was their heyday. And, when in the post World War II boom, when they would set out a new subdevelopment, they would set the corner lots for churches. They all knew that. And so you'd have a church of 200, 300, 400, 500 people, and they'd build sort of a middle size. And now, we have the same thing going on in retail. So again, it's the transitions are costly, but I tend to think we'll make it through. Living Stones might not make it through, because Living Stones was, founded in 1963. And generally speaking, churches live for 50 to 60 years if they can survive their first 5. So, and 70% of church plants fail. Again, all this stuff is studied like crazy.
Right.
But Living Stones is, in 2023 will hit 60 years old. And unless my weird YouTube stuff somehow changes the dynamics of this church, it will probably die. And just like almost every other church of its age, of its era, and people will be left behind and abandoned in that process. Now, how does COVID and YouTube figure into that? I have no idea, but it may, or it may not.
Well,
we don't know.
Almost wondering how like technology is really, buzzword is like decentralization. And I'm wondering if the church, as we see it as like one building with one leader, is maybe more centralized than it even has to be. Like at my church, we talk a lot about sort of everyone's a minister, that's what appealed to me, is like leaving a church where it's like either you're nothing or you're a pastor, where there's like I get spoken to about my me being a ministry, and it kind of what you're talking about is like just needing to listen to people. I think that's a big part, is can we in any situation do ministry? And that's they kind of all this teaching revolves around the ecclesia, and kind of that being a word that was claimed from secular culture at the time and is about ministry in the marketplace. And that's sort of, we took that and made that this centralized church thing, but it really wasn't anything that had to be separated from secular society. So, what maybe doesn't exist, I don't know what the pastor's role, like a specific pastor or preacher, maybe can be put on YouTube, and then the ministry aspect is taken up by just followers of Christ, people that want to sacrifice their time to hear their coworkers when the rest of your coworkers are too busy, and just kind of move on to the next meeting or whatever.
The church is full. So I've got books up here: house churches, cell churches, church in the I mean, the truth is, a lot of this experimentation continues to go on, and it's even, we don't even know quite how YouTube will manage this. We could have mega churches where, see, part of the problem is that there are lots of natural things that happen, and so okay, everybody's a minister. That was one of Rick Warren's, every member a minister. The megachurch emphasized that because they're trying to deal with the size. Well, the problem is that, okay, so you're having a Bible study and you're going round robin around, and you pretty quickly figure out, I like going to Bible study better when this person teaches. He teaches better than the other ones. Okay, so we're always going to have this person teach. Okay. And then, if you follow these things, kind of the natural progressions happen. So, but churches right now are, it's unusual in North America to have a middle-sized church that can afford a full-time Christian, a full-time seminary trained minister. Then a few years ago, they did a study that showed that seminary training was actually a liability in terms of success in church planting, which, if you think about some things, but now let's say you've got the excitement about, let's say, orthodoxy, where orthodoxy again will demand a fairly well-educated local church pastor, because they're going to want him to be read in the church fathers, et cetera. So it's actually, you've got all these dynamics always in play. And at least especially in North America, it's a very vibrant, creative, religious environment. And so the church does a lot of experimenting, which is very Protestant-y. But that's all that is happening all around us, and COVID just adds a whole new layer. So, it's the ride is always bumpy, but it's also exciting.
So is that sort of where you derive a lot of your optimism from? The tradition in experimenting?
Well, I derive my optimism because Christianity just keeps going. And it's, again, if you read church history, there's always these messes. The church gets itself into a horrendous mess, and you think, that's it. But, then, there's all kinds of issues in Northern Europe with the Roman Catholic Church. You have the Protestant Reformation, and not so much in Southern Europe. And in many ways, the Protestant Reformation forces the Roman Catholic Church to address some longstanding things in a significant way. And Luther, in fact, does reform the Roman Catholic Church, just no longer from inside of it. There's issues with Lutheranism, so new things develop. And, the Wesleys come up, and Methodism is just enormously important. And then Pentecostalism comes up and spreads all over the world. And, Christianity continues to grow, and it's growing gangbusters in Asia and Africa right now, even as it's struggling in Europe and North America. But I'm not counting the church out. Christianity, more than any other significant world religion, manages to reliably, seemingly reinvent itself without losing itself completely. And again, there's always loss in these transitions, but usually another generation will come around and look at that loss and say, oh man, look what we lost, and do something new with it. So
I was waiting for you to try to give me an answer, give me a solution, and engage with the problem. And you're really creatively avoiding it. But I really appreciate that, actually, because I feel like you're just using a couple more words to tell me, trust God.
That's right. And I'm a Calvinist. We're not smart enough to get out of this mess. So why don't you trust Jesus to do it? Because he's been faithful for thousands of years, and the Holy Spirit is still with us. And, if you were to ask me 5 years ago, would the Orthodox Church have a sort of renaissance on the back of a Canadian psychologist doing biblical series on the Bible who'd have benzo withdrawal? And you can't make this stuff up, but here we are. So, and that I would be spending my time talking to Catholics and Orthodox and people all over the spectrum. But here we are. So why worry? Jesus says, do not be worried. He says, in this world, you will have trouble. Yeah, we do. But I have overcome the world. So trust me. Okay. That seems basic Christianity. And a lot of the other stuff is hard, but trust Jesus. Okay. Let's start there.
Thank you so much. Well, maybe let's end there.
All right. Well, this was fun.
It was really fun. I really appreciate you doing this.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure.
Well, that was interesting. If you enjoyed this conversation, feel free to subscribe, like the video. Any kind of engagement really helps out with algorithm stuff as far as I'm aware. Another thing I'd love if you would do would be to share this video with someone who you think might find it interesting, or specifically might disagree with it about something, or disagree with you about something, and use it as a launch pad to have an interesting conversation, have an interesting disagreement, maybe. Because that's really what this whole thing is about for me. I think that having, honest disagreements is a really useful and meaningful thing to do. Anyways, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.